chose the path that I walked on. It was my choice. I did it not knowing that I was choosing that path, but I chose it. And so I took a walk on the path that was called homosexuality. And I lived in that life for 25 or so years. And in that life, I thought I was happy. I had been raised in the Church of God in Christ. I grew up under my parents who brought us to church every day almost. And particularly when there was a revival going on. But we grew up in church and we stayed in church, and everything was centered around our church life and the people in the church. And so I was reared in believing in God. And as I grew up, I began to drift away from the church. Living in my parents' house, you didn't get up and just decide you weren't going to go to church. Everybody who lived in our house had to go to church. It was mandatory. You got up. Otherwise you weren't living in my mother's house. You got up and you went to church. Mandatory. No ands, ifs, or buts. Even my father. Everybody was up and out to church. And so this is what we did. And even when I was in college, I was still going to church as long as I lived in my parents' house. Every Sunday I was in church. And we never missed a Sunday. There was never a Sunday my mother rolled over and didn't feel like she wanted to go to church. There was never a service that she didn't attend. She got up and she went to church. She took pleasure in the Lord. And so I grew up watching my mother, pray and sing as she worked around the house and as she did her chores, and her life centered around God. She prayed and she read her Bible. I grew up watching that. But as I grew up, I decided I didn't like church so much, and I took another path, and I decided to get on a road that I didn't realize at the time I was getting on. But it was a choice. I chose that. Like people choose to drink, or they choose to do drugs, or they choose to become prostitutes, or they choose. Some people actually don't go into prostitution by choice. Many people are forced into prostitution, and after a while it becomes their lifestyle. Children are bought into the selling of their body and being abused and all of that. That's not necessarily by choice. But when you're an adult person and you make a decision to go on a path, or maybe you're a little child and you decide you're going to experiment doing certain kind of things, then you're making that choice. That was your choice and your decision. Once our minds start to develop and we start to think about doing things, and doing things that our parents don't necessarily know about, then we're making choices at that point. And so the choices that we make in life are things that we have to live with. But we also have to say that I made that choice. That was the choice that I made. I made the choice that I made. I don't blame it on anyone or anything. I made the choice. But I thank God that He loved me enough, that He considered me, that He desired me, and that He called me out. And I thank God that He gave me ears to hear and a will to do His bidding, to come out. And He drew me out. And in drawing me out, He gave me also a will to stay out, a determined mind to not go back, to never go back to the life that I had been in, to not become involved in that ever again. And I know that I'm never going to do that because, frankly, I tell you, He actually took the desire out of my mouth to do that. So I don't have a taste, I don't have a desire to run back and to do that. And so I think about it as my grandmother. My grandmother, Ma, she used to dip snuff. And all the years that I knew her, from infant, growing up, through all the years until she was late in her life, Ma dipped snuff. And she did it every day, all day, basically. And so my grandmother became saved after my mother. And it's interesting because my mother didn't go around preaching and trying to tell people, what to do, what not to do. She wasn't that kind of person, but she lived her life. She lived her life as a saved woman. She didn't wear pants. She was always dressed appropriately for a saved woman. And back, if we're talking about back in those days, because I do understand certain things, and but she took joy and pleasure in how, and basically she grew up in the way that she dressed, so it wasn't foreign to her that much, to be and to live and to do, because that's what she grew up into. And so they looked at her life, and they looked at how well she was living and how happy she was, and how she really always seemed to be at peace. And there always seemed to be a certain level of joy. There were times when I knew that she was concerned about, but you would hear her, I would hear her singing. And I never really heard her pray, but I knew she prayed. I never really saw her fasting, but I know she probably fasted. But she loved and reverenced the Lord. She had a passion for him. And this is something that she displayed in her walk with God. And if you came in contact with her, you clearly knew she was a woman of God. It wasn't that she was coming at you with biblical texts or any kind of way that showed it by speech, but it was how she lived her life. The example that she set forward in her presentation of herself as a woman in the Lord. And so over time, my grandmother became saved. Over time, my aunt, practically everybody in my mother's family became saved over time. And it's amazing because over time, God will do a work. Over time, he did a work in me. And so my grandmother dipped the snuff, and when she became saved, it was like immediately she ceased to dip snuff. She just stopped. It was gone. And that's what coming out of the life of homosexuality was like for me. It just ceased. Let me invite you to pick up a copy of my book. It's called The Bishop's Wife by Bernadine Smith. The Bishop's Wife. You need to get your copy now.